While it is easy to watch something and criticize it openly when the general consensus is in your favor, it is much harder to determine why and how it is that this very thing flopped to begin with. Don't worry, no one in their right mind would go as far as to say that Velma is a good show, me included, even for the fairly low standards of animated television for these past few years. But its downfall is not surprising. It appears as though many creators have come to the conclusion that this show is not good. The general opinion goes from "this series is utter and total garbage" to "this show really is not worth your time." The online discourse is hot, so much so that Velma became the lowest rated television show in the history of IMDb in less than 2 weeks after its initial release. All of this appears normal, however. Too normal, in fact. To the point where malicious self-sabotage of its own story for temporary financial gain becomes a legitimate theory and not just a conspiracy. Unfortunately, this legitimate theory does not stand when confronted with a much simpler, much more coherent explanation of what happened. Let's begin with how Velma flopped. Unflattering comparisons are going to be drawn, so buckle your seatbelts. Velma flopped because it fell in a trap. Ironically enough, Scooby-Doo has always been about catching monsters, avoiding and dismantling traps, and catching the bad guy, and as a testament to how poorly Velma respects its source material, it has managed to do none of the above. The trap I am talking about is quite common. You might be falling for it yourself when watching this video. It's doing something for the sake of doing something. It's all well and good to produce a piece of media. If the purpose of this piece of media is to simply exist, it will not and cannot grow even with the biggest of budgets. The great part about producing a cinematic experience, no matter how basic it may be, is that simply having a purpose for its existence is enough to make it accomplished. Sleep, 1964 by Andy Warhol, is perhaps the best example of this. This movie is a 5-hour chronicle of a night of sleep starring John Giorno. Nothing else happens, but because there is a purpose to the movie, it doesn't need to be anything else. As an anti-movie itself, any frivolous effects or semblance of a narrative would make it irrelevant. Its goal is to show that as long as a movie has a purpose, it's accomplished. It is meta-commentary on the nature of filmmaking itself. Unlike Sleep, however, Velma wishes to produce meta-commentary as a way to give itself a purpose, and unfortunately it falls utterly and completely flat in its attempt to do so because it is irrelevant. The meta-commentary of Warhol is a physical proof of concept. The meta-commentary of Velma is righteous indignation at the current state of affairs. While the latter can be exemplified by a disagreeable housewife displeased yet unwavering in her pity, the former is much like a designer trying to exemplify an idea into a tangible object. The difference between the two lies in what could be conceptualized as the drive. Warhol wishes to open a path for future filmmakers that may be stuck within their already established framework, while Mrs. Kaling may delude herself into thinking that her work and her piece of media is doing something similar. It is by far not the case. Any sheen of progressiveness Velma might have is quickly dismantled by its cynical, bitter, and backwards attitude towards the things it attempts to comment on. There is not a single hint of progress towards change in the whole show so far, whatever form that may take, be it more female leads in animated cartoons, refurbishing dying franchises to newer audiences, or even displaying a more mature narrative to an older audience. These are all things that can be seen in Harley Quinn by Justin Halpern, Dean Lorey, and Patrick Schumacher. They are not concepts that are adverse to success, they simply must have a purpose of some sort. In Harley Quinn, it is to give a proper narrative shot at a beloved yet underdeveloped character, or what Velma should have been. Instead, the quote-unquote goal of Velma is to sneer at and criticize society at large through the use of its tropes in order to make viewers pay more attention to shows like it, which from the very start stifles any possibility of growth and change, since it requires the creators to focus solely on the now and then and not on the future. You cannot walk forward if you do not look forward. Alright, let us move on to why Velma flopped, and more specifically why it fell before it could even run. There is one other show in animated television history which succeeded in its goal of criticizing the status quo in order to make its viewers pay more attention to its medium through the use of meta-commentary. Rick and Morty. The meteoric rise of Rick and Morty to household stardom is nothing to scoff at. In the span of a few months, it went from a cult classic to a name everyone knew both on the streets and on the web. It gained its popularity through the use of something barely anyone had ever seen before, that is to say an animated cartoon with relatively childish presentation with deep, mature themes and criticisms. While they were examples of shows walking the same path before it, Rick and Morty managed to make its appeal wide enough to encompass society at large, a trait it shares with the greatest show shows in animation. It had the drive, it wished to legitimize its medium as a genuine form of expression in all manners possible, and to do so it had to produce some amount of meta-commentary on the then state of affairs. Besides that, it also had to produce an overarching narrative, adult themes and moments, and most importantly, it had to create something that was completely new. If it attempted to replicate the formula and presentation of other shows, it would not be able to distinguish itself. The problem becomes apparent when we start to consider the downfall of the show itself. Through the 5th season, there is a painfully obvious drop in quality, which continues into season 6. This is because Rick and Morty could not escape the curse of meta-commentary, something it had brought upon itself unknowingly. The success of the early Rick and Morty seasons had legitimized the animated television medium as a way to tell mature and complex stories. BoJack Horseman following in its stead very shortly after the success of its first season, for instance. But BoJack does not try to make commentary on its own medium, instead it focuses on producing a shockingly accurate parody of Hollywood. In doing so, BoJack has arguably better quality over the span of its 6 seasons, whereas Rick and Morty was already losing its quality by season 5. The reason why is because of this curse, which is actually a very simple concept. To do proper meta-commentary, one must have a message. This isn't a problem if your message keeps being relevant, but once this message is received, processed, and incorporated into whatever it is that was criticized, then it dissolves into nothingness. Repeating it becomes irrelevant, which makes the meta-commentary irrelevant itself, which means that a show that is built upon it becomes irrelevant also. For criticism to be valid when aiming it at the status quo, it has to oppose it in some shape or form, the meta aspect of it providing the method to the madness. But when the message, that is to say the criticism, becomes the status quo itself, then everything falls apart. The fact of the matter is that shows like Velma are exactly the status quo it attempts to criticize. Whether the writers are aware of this or not, I am not sure, but it is the case that trying to dunk on these series while simultaneously having a similar presentation is nothing short of shooting yourself in the foot. Biting the hand which feeds you alienates your audience. It makes the characters and the entire endeavor of the show look like a snot-nosed brat crying out for candy in the food aisle of the supermarket. It is arrogant and displeasing. Not only that, but it should not come as a surprise to anyone that this show was going to shoot itself in the foot. The very first promotional material for it is so outrageously cringe and obnoxious in its meta-style commentary on the state of society and animated shows at large that it is painfully obvious it was not only going to be bad, but also mean-spirited.
Dear HBO Max, I just learned you intend to make a genre-bending comedic origin story of Judy Jetson. When I heard this new version of Judy Jetson wouldn't be boy crazy, the only word I had to describe my disgust is jinkies. If there is one thing the internet agrees on, it's that you should never change anything ever. I hope you die. Sincerely, Velma. Well, at least Judy's still white. Unknown caller. Spooky. Hello? Velma Dinkley speaking.
Hello, Velma. Do you like solving mysteries?
Yeah, but I'm actually much more three-dimensional than that. Who is this?
That's the mystery. And solve it quick, because I'm in your house.
A serial killer calling from inside my house? Yes, that's a classic, and that's my point. Why change anything when the classics all still work, right? Wait, you're inside my house!
But it goes even beyond that. Attempting to begin with to have the same presentation as these shows is shooting yourself in the other foot. The proof is quite simple. Within the show, we see 3 things: meta-commentary, an overarching narrative, and adult themes and moments. This is almost exactly the same core characteristics as Rick and Morty, but it does not manage to replicate its third element, creating something new to distinguish itself. By trying to copy their message and the way they brandish it, you also come to the same conclusions, and if the audience already knows these conclusions because the other shows have already spread their message and it's become the status quo, then they will not engage with your work. That's the main reason why Velma failed so badly. The show tries to do something that's already been done and accomplished and then fails, which leaves it without any purpose. It has no drive, and the reason why it has no drive is because Rick and Morty has already driven for it. Hell, Rick and Morty has already driven for Rick and Morty itself, although that may be the subject of another video. If that is something which you would be interested in, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching.